Welcome back. One woman is using her personal experience to make a difference in the lives of children and families who need that extra support. Joining us to discuss the work she's doing to keep families together is Eunice Escudero. And from the organization, The Children's Village, we have David Collins. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So, Eunice, can you tell me about your background that inspired you to enter the field of working with children and their families?
Yes, absolutely. First off, just thank you for the opportunity to share what inspires me to work with children and families. For me, it's always been my own family that inspires me every day to do what I do. More specifically, my grandparents emigrated to the United States from Chile in the 1970s, along with my mother and aunt. And they would often share how challenging it was at first to find their footing in the US. My grandpa would always tell us that New York City was very competitive and you always had to have your wits about you when navigating this big city.
Now, I understand that when your family came to the US, as you mentioned, there were several factors working against you that made the experience challenging. Can you explain what those factors were?
Absolutely. Language barrier, as well as establishing a sense of community, were two major factors. My mom would often share that when she emigrated, she was about 11 or 12. So she didn't really know the language. And back in the 70s, school systems didn't really have bilingual classes or integrated classes in that sense to support anybody who was new to the US. So she sat there, the material went over her head, and she was failing miserably. So thankfully, a school teacher saw that there were some, deeper challenges with her and pulled her aside and realized it was that she didn't know the English language. So he gifted her a Spanish English dictionary, and she would translate all of her assignments by herself, answer them in Spanish, and then translate it all back. And you can imagine that would take hours. Eventually, my mom made it to high school, but dropped out because she just found it to be way too challenging and experienced a lot of bullying as a result.
Now, I'm curious to hear from both of you. Do you feel those challenges are still prevalent today, especially for families that are moving from other countries where, they may not speak English?
I could answer that, David, if you like. I would like to share that yes, absolutely. Families that emigrate from all parts of the world to the US may experience these struggles like language barriers and establishing a supportive community.
Yeah, 100% agree. We're at Children's Village. We're involved in some programs that try to make the adjustment experience easier for children and families who are arriving. And there are some improvements that have been made, but I think there's still a long way to go.
Are there possibly any other factors that are often overlooked when people see families and children struggling?
I think that with some other factors that can be overlooked or I'd say like overcasted is usually we see the young adults really struggling, in their school community or even in their, own neighborhood. Whereas back home, they may have had, again, this sense of community and, it takes a village to raise a child. So, the caregivers would have relied on their, aunties and uncles and cousins. When you put that youth in a new environment, they have to establish new support and a new ecology pretty quickly, and that comes with its own challenges.
Well, I love that you said, it takes a village to raise a child because that's going to kind of lead into my next question. Could you actually tell us more about your organization, Children's Village?
Sure. Children's Village was founded in 1851. It was historically a residential institution for mostly recently arrived immigrants, and the young people served over the years reflected sort of the waves of immigration to New York City. Over in the last 20 years, I think our field and Children's Village specifically have realized that institutional care should not be the default, and that children need loving families. They need connections to their communities. And usually they already have those, and what they need is support to maintain them. So over the last 15 years or so, our programming has shifted away from institutional care and towards community-based programming to help support families and keep them together. And
Now,
Eunice
David,
is an example, a big example of that.
okay, yeah, I was just going to ask, I'm curious to know like why you joined, this field and working with families and children.
David or myself?
That was for David.
Oh, sure. I tell people I fell into this by chance, but I stayed in it by choice. I got a job as a tutor when I was 19 years old at a group home for boys, and never left. I became a child care worker. I was a frontline staff for many years, and then later on had an opportunity to go back to school and become a social worker and stay in the field. So I just love working with young people. I didn't know that was going to be my calling when I first took the job, but once I was there, it just felt right.
Now, I'm curious to know, how does this program cater to children as well as parents and or adults?
So, at Children's Village are several community-based programs. However, all of the community-based programs cater to all individuals in the home. So the caregiver subsystem, the children subsystem. And I would say for the caregivers, the support is really just offering, either reinforcing or teaching them skills to reinforce their structure, the hierarchy of the home, right? They're the parents. And, I know we were talking about families that emigrate or are new to the US. They may feel that structure shift a little bit. Whereas at home, they were the head of the household. Here, they may find it a bit challenging when they hear acronyms like ACS being thrown at them. It kind of like may shatter them a little bit or have them shake a little bit. So we come in and we really help empower caregivers by letting them know and showing them their own evidence that they really have what it takes to establish that hierarchy here. For the children, or I would say, more specifically for those young adults who are really struggling, we see some of those behaviors in the community shine through. It's really getting down to the bottom of what's really driving some of these behaviors. And to be more specific, behaviors like truancy or substance use or just association with the wrong crowd, right? Not really hanging around with the great kind of kids out there. So really understanding what's driving the behavior and then aligning that with the caregiver's desired outcomes and then supporting them by just coming up with interventions and ways to help caregivers really, again, strengthen their support to their young person in the home. So it's very holistic.
Awesome. So can you tell me more about the Families First approach the Children's Village is taking and how that began?
Sure. So Families First is federal legislation that was passed in 2018, but I'd say it also refers to a philosophy that generally children need to be with families, and that that families are the best place for them, and that most families have the ability with the right supports to take care of their kids. Prior to the Families First Act being passed by Congress in 2018, there was only federal funding available for family separation. So every state and city is required to have a child protection and a child welfare system, but they only received federal dollars if they were taking kids out of the home. And that's produced terrible outcomes. It's a historic injustice. It's primarily impacted Black and brown communities, including here in New York City. And it's just the wrong way to go about social services to children and families. So it's the old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, for years, from a federal perspective, all we had was foster care. And that was not the way to go about it. So in 2018, the Families First Preventive Services Act authorized the use of federal dollars to do more family preservation, to provide legal supports to families who are under investigation, and to be more restrictive about when we would consider putting a young person into like an institutional setting, and set standards for when that would happen, and some of the kind of guardrails around that process. Yeah. So overall, it's designed to make it more likely that kids stay with their families and succeed in the community, and we're big believers in that.
Wow, that's amazing. I really didn't know that. So thank you so much for sharing that with me. Because of that, I would really like to know, what are some challenges that, children, that are dealing with this, whether they're in foster care or group homes, et cetera, what are these challenges that they're facing that we may not be aware of?
I'll say, what we always tell people is that we don't have any bad kids at Children's Village. We have kids to whom bad things have happened. And a lot of people look at some of those, surface behaviors that Eunice was describing, like, truancy or experimenting with drugs or having some high risk peer networks. And they think of, oh, this kid is acting up, or this young person is on the wrong path. But Usually there are a lot of systemic failures that get to that point. And that doesn't mean that we don't help kids change their behavior or try to hold them accountable if they do harm to someone. We want to teach them what are the expectations, in society, but we just also recognize that, there are institutional failures that have led to those situations for those kids most of the time, whether it's, living in highly segregated neighborhoods where there's been disinvestment from school systems and from community resources, whether it's over policing, whether it's, some of the barriers that families face due to being low income or being recently arrived immigrants. The list kind of goes on and on. And often these are intergenerational barriers. They're things that have been going on in families for a long time. And really, someone needs to step in and break that cycle as opposed to pointing a finger and blaming people.
Now, I really want to go in to talk about the prevention work that you're doing. I think it's super important, just as like helping with recovery. How do we prevent this, these tragedies from happening?
I think, again, it goes back to the family, and not just the family, but like David was saying, all these other systemic factors involved. So in the preventive work that we do, we usually, a youth is highlighted. So a particular youth in the home becomes, the identified client, so to say. But that's not to say that the approach is going to be very narrow and individualistic. It's very systemic. So some of the behaviors that we may see might be some truancy. I would like to phrase this like truancy light, where it's like the youth is perhaps cutting classes here and there, attending some classes, maybe experimenting with some drugs, maybe arriving home late, but these behaviors have not exacerbated to the point of the youth getting arrested. So the preventive programs really come in to work with these families and their social supports as well. And if they don't have one, then they help establish one to really tackle some of those concerns. And like I said, the interventions are very specific to the needs of the youth and to the strengths of the family.
Thank you so much for joining us, both of you. I really appreciate taking the time to speak with me about this. Can you just let people know where they can learn more about your organization?
Sure. You can visit us on the web at childrensvillage.org, or you can find us on social media. And if anybody is in need of support in the Bronx or anywhere else, feel free to reach out to us. And if we don't have it, we probably know somebody that does.
All right. Thank you. We'll be right back with more Open BXRX Tuesday.